Susan and I have done a very thorough review of the effects of separation from their parents or other caregivers on children. I don't know if you remember 6 years ago when it hit the newspapers that then President Trump was separating migrant children from their parents and putting them in detention facilities. Do you remember that? Nod your head, raise your electronic hand, do something. Everyone, the world, was horrified, simply horrified. And that was when I decided I needed to do a review of the effects of separation on children to be able to prove to politicians that separating children from their parents was dangerous to the children's well-being. I contacted a number of you in different countries so that we could get a worldwide view of this. And so thank you. If you helped me get into the German language literature, the Italian language literature, the Russian literature, if you helped me, thank you. You show up in the reference list on this paper. And then other things took over and I shelved it. Well, I didn't shelve it. I just didn't do anything more. And it sat and it sat. And then one day, Susan and I said, this is too important to let it die. And Susan joined me and we went to work just as hard as we could to identify all the literature on separating children from their parents and its effects on the children. The findings were astounding. They are the clearest findings that I have seen in a 40-year career of looking at a variety of literature on children and families' well-being. This is the clearest, most unanimous finding that I have found, and I think it's true for Susan as well, and she can nod or shake her head no. This is astoundingly clear. Separating children from the person who they consider to be their caregiver, their protector, is harmful. 100%. Every time you separate a child from the person they trust to take care of them, it is harmful. Does not matter why you do it. It does not matter where you send them next. You have created harm the minute you take the child away from their caregiver. Now, usually that caregiver is their parent. But if they've been in foster care for a long time, it's the foster carer. If they've been adopted as a child with a memory of a previous caregiver, once they have changed their alliance from the previous caregiver to the adoptive parent and you move them, you do harm. Let me be clear. Putting children into foster care is 100% harmful. Moving a child of 9 months or older into adoption is 100% harmful. Separating children from one of their caregivers in a divorce is 100% harmful. Respite care for a foster parent is 100% harmful to the child. Changing from an inadequate foster home to a better foster home is 100% harmful. Always. Once the child has an attachment figure, separating them is harmful. That doesn't mean there aren't reasons to do it. And there might not be greater harm in leaving them where they are. But when you make the decision to change a child's placement, even for a day or two, respite care, you are always creating psychological trauma for separation from the protective caregiver. There might be reasons, and it might be the best thing to do, but do not think you can do it without the child paying a cost for that. Those are very strong statements. And we think they are warranted, having done a very intense, very broad search of the literature. So that's what I'm going to do now. I'm going to switch to an exciting PowerPoint, more exciting than any other PowerPoint you've ever seen, and try to show you some of what gives me the authority to make those really strong statements with which I began. So we're going to talk about the devastating effects of separating children from their parents. And we're going to conclude with an agenda for action. And of course, I am me, Pat Crittenden, and Susan Spieker is my co-author. And so are many of you who provided some of the information from your countries and your cultures. We were shocked when we looked at the literature to discover that former President Trump did nothing unusual. What was unusual is that we, the population, found out about it. Governments separate thousands of children from their parents every year. We reviewed the effects of, and I'm going to give you a list in a minute, but please notice, I offer no citations in this talk, but they are available on IASA's and the Family Relations Institute's website. The full 125-page paper with every citation you could ever want is there. We reviewed the effects of foster care, adoption, divorce, undocumented immigration, illegal immigration, parental incarceration in prisons, and indigenous status. And the bottom line is, separation is always harmful, regardless of the reason for it. But beyond that, the rates of separation or removing children from their parents' custody is increasing. It's happening more frequently now than in the past. The numbers of professionals who work in this field are increasing even more. So the ratio of professional to child is dropping. We are hiring more and more professionals, more than we used to in the past. This is a powerful bureaucracy of people engaged in removing children from their parents. Then, a very ominous finding. Separation has multi-generational effects. I think we all could understand why being separated would have an effect on the child who is separated. But did you know that it would have effects on their marriage, on their parenting, on their children? And then when it happens repeatedly, it becomes part of a culture. I'm an old lady now. I'm very proud of it. I've been around since the beginning of child protection in the United States in the late 1960s, when removing children to foster care was rare. It's not rare anymore. And I've been around long enough that the cases that I see, because I do some of the court forensic analysis, the cases that I see are often former foster children coming back into child protection because they didn't take care of their children adequately. We took the authority to raise them better than their parents could do. And we often fail. they cannot raise their children adequately, and they come back in a second or third generation. We didn't know that back in the 1960s and 70s. It's the 2020s. Now it can be known, and I want to enable you to know it. We have multi-generational effects from the failure of the government choosing to raise children. Another example of this is in indigenous communities, where in a number of countries, I'll just cross the globe here, Australia, New Zealand, Sweden, Norway, Canada, the US, China. We have taken indigenous groups, minority groups that do not fit the main culture, and taken children from their parents and institutionalized them to give them the culture of the major culture. That was done over more than 100 years. The effect is failed indigenous communities where people no longer know how to choose partners, how to raise children, how to live without chemical stimulants or depressants. By placing generations of children in institutions, we have destroyed communities of people across multiple generations. So when you hear us talk about studies of the effects on children, think about the next generation and the next. These are multi-generational effects, and that's really important to keep in mind. The total financial cost of removing children from their caregivers, usually parents, but sometimes foster parents, adoptive parents, a separated marital couple like that, that total cost is increasing. Every year, more money needs to be put into doing this. That's less money for treatment resources because governments do not give more money, they only redistribute the money. And the total suffering to children is incalculable. My slides are going to be all about facts, but what I want you to capture from it is the emotion of suffering, sadness, feeling frantically anxious. This is a very emotional topic about which I will give you some facts. Most of the reading that we have done is about professionals' understanding of what happened. Children's perspectives tend to be missing. Professionals talk about them, but that's the professional's perspective on the children. The professionals tend to think that separation and placement with a safe caregiver protects children from dangerous parents. And they tend to think that children's symptoms of distress, which are well documented and broadly experienced by children, are due to prior maltreatment by their original caregiver. The children's perspective is that loss of a parent, whoever is functioning as their trusted parent, is perceived as the absence of protection. Take me away from my mother, and you take me away from safety. It is the maximum threat to a child to have no trusted caregiver. I know the person who takes the child to foster care or who arranges the adoption. That person can be trusted, but not by the child. Even short, temporary placements are harmful. The minute the child perceives themselves to be unprotected, the harm starts. And it doesn't really change with how long the child is unprotected. Once they know my caregiver cannot protect me, they have experienced the harm. And many of the symptoms of distress in the new placement stem from the separation itself, not from previous maltreatment. by the biological parents in cases of maltreatment, by the former foster parent if a child is moved from foster care to adoption, by the other parent if a divorce causes a child to lose access to one parent. All of those symptoms of distress are usually about separation and not about prior mistreatment. Children's distress symptoms are the same across all of the reasons for separation. There are not symptoms that are tied to maltreatment, symptoms that are tied to adoption, symptoms that are tied to being placed in an indigenous institution. The symptoms of distress are symptoms of human distress. They include depression, anxiety, withdrawal, physical and relational aggression, defiance, theft, vandalism, poor self-control, poor peer relations, school failure, and then diagnostic states like PTSD, bipolar depression, schizophrenia. And this is true even when you control for prior trauma. Still, the separation has additional effects greater than anything before the separation. And violent offending in the case of separation from father. The particular risk to male children from being separated from their fathers. I want you to look at the distress of this boy. I want you to try to think of children that you're seeing with faces like this, an outreach arm for a person that cannot get back. I want you, when you think of these cases, to try to remember your own feelings when you looked on a child who was this desperate. There are behavioral disorders. There are emotional disorders. There are somatic disorders. They're all important. But the somatic disorders are so unspeakable that the body turns on itself. So I'm going to talk about each of the reasons that children might be separated. Foster care and child protection, which I chose to put in quotes, is one of them. I put child protection in quotes because, as I told you, I've been here since the late 60s watching it. When it was child protection in response to Helper and Kemp's book, The Battered Child. But it has changed over time. It has become more inclusive. The children are no longer just battered. Sometimes their parents let them walk to school alone. Heaven forbid. So, and some of the things that we do are protective, and some of them are harmful in and of themselves. So I put child protection in quotes. 60 years later, I'm much less certain that we are protecting children as we intend to do. In the United States, approximately 300,000 children are placed in foster care each year. 300,000. That's almost a seventh of 70% of all the children at one time. I botched that up. 0.7% of all the children at any one time. And 10% of those children return home within 30 days. So I would argue we made a mistake. They shouldn't have been separated to begin with. There were things that we could have done in the family without harming the child with separation if the separation was that short. And 1 in 3 American children is investigated by Child Protective Services. 1 in 3. Now, that won't include most of your children because you're middle class. But if you're Black or Hispanic or low income, it's more than 1 in 3. That's where the numbers are. Not at all evenly spread across the population. In Canada, almost 1% of the children are in care at any one time. Look at that number. That's astounding. In the UK, the number is very similar to the US, and 3% of children in the UK are known to social services at any one time. 3% of the population. If you compare children who have had similar amounts or not amounts of maltreatment, seriously similar maltreatment, those children who were separated from their parents have developmentally worse outcomes than the children who remained in their home. There is a risk when you take a child from an inadequate home. We're not arguing about whether the home was adequate or not. When you take a child from an inadequate home, there is a reasonable possibility that the outcomes, developmental outcomes, will be worse than if the child stayed at home. The outcomes are worse with each change of home. That is, if the child goes to respite care, if the child goes to a different foster home, if the child is reunified from a long-term foster placement, if the child is adopted, every one of those changes has an additional harmful effect. I don't think we think of that for respite care. I don't think we think of that if we move the child to a better foster home. I don't think we are doing harm when we reunify a child. But the separation is harmful, even if everything else is positive. I'm not saying what you should do. I'm saying what costs you need to consider and why reunification should be considered much sooner and separation should be avoided altogether. And adoption has a cost if it involves separation after the age of about 9 months. I've already talked about the intergenerational effects of placement permanency and parenting. A child over 9 months who is moved from one home to another is at risk for not being able themselves to establish a permanent home and to raise their children to adulthood. That's a horrible cost to pay for changing homes, changing parents in childhood. Non-white children are disproportionately put into foster care. Reunification and adoption are infrequent. Of course they happen, but they are not the probable outcome. The adverse consequences of separation, which I'm arguing are very substantial and last a lifetime, are not considered in court decision-making. We looked at the laws of several different countries. None of them ask that one consider the cost to the child of separating him from the parents he is currently with. That needs to change. In the equation of why you would or wouldn't make a decision to separate a child needs to be included the cost to that child of any separation from his trusted caregivers. And I would ask, is this protecting children? That's what we've all set out to do, and I don't think our intention has changed at all. But we know something about the outcomes that we didn't know in 1970 or 80 or 90. It's 2023. We did not find any paper published anywhere that says what we are saying today. But we're saying it. Now it's known. You've probably all seen the equivalent sign in your country as child protection tries very hard to place their children permanently. And children go out and advertise for families, for their forever home. So some recommendations regarding foster care. Training in attachment and the psychological trauma of separation should be available to everyone. And I will have to say as a footnote, any form of attachment that talks about disorganization doesn't get it. In the empirical literature, not in clinical practice, in the empirical literature, disorganization is found to be a not valid concept. We need increases in both and solutions. Both your loving biological family and an alternative family that will come and help your parents. Not instead dump the biology, get the strange people. Both and solutions that give children more, not less. We need to prioritize non-adversarial approaches. One shouldn't be going to court fighting people over who gets the object, a child. We need to emphasize relationships and interpersonal systems. We need to support families with long-term local paraprofessionals, people who come out of their own community, who know something about what it's like to live where these people live, and who will help this family as acquired kin, like an auntie or an uncle or a rent-a-grandma. I think often the distance between the mostly white, mostly female, almost always middle-class people who work with mostly not white, definitely not middle-class, very often minority families in high-risk neighborhoods. I think that distinction means that we don't always understand the perspective of the families we're dealing with. We need to send in people who have been successful from their own community and who will function as acquired family. And we need more research on the experiences and biases of foster parents and of professionals. Who are these savior people? The bits of data that have come my way that are not informal studies and therefore they can't be fully trusted suggest that these two groups, foster parents and professionals in the helping professions, are not normative for their communities. They come with particular problems and biases. That's okay. Not knowing it and not working with it is not okay. Who are the foster parents? Well, a study done by Helen Gogarty in Ireland, but unpublished, it was her dissertation study, found that 100% of her sample of foster parents had an unresolved, still actively troubling childhood loss of their own. When I read that, I went, wow, what does that mean about why they want to have a foster child, why they want to have a child that they're almost certain to lose, and how they will handle that child? And then some of you know that I was a foster parent. I was about 25 years old when two little girls came to live with me and my husband. It didn't turn out well. And I've puzzled about that for a very long time. But when I saw Helen Gogarty's finding, I went, oh, because I have a childhood loss of my youngest sister. And then I thought, this sat in the back of my mind. And then I knew this. It was a dramatic, tragic loss. I don't think of it every day, but I'm sure I think of it every week. It's right up there in the front of my mind. And as I was thinking about Helen Gogarty's findings, I suddenly bumped into the unspeakable, unspoken loss my husband had. He had a little brother who died of a degenerative neurological disorder. And he watched his brother lose skills till he couldn't even breathe. And he died. I didn't know that until we'd been married for a long time. Nobody spoke of it. And I emphasize these two: the losses you never can forget and the losses you can never mention. We need to know about this for foster parents, not so we can kick them out, so we can help it not to interact with the way they raise the foster children in their home. Christian evangelicals often choose to take multiple foster children, and they are identified in newspaper articles, short TV presentations, as these wonderful people who have taken 10, 15 children. How much attention does any one child get? How long do they stay? What are the parents looking for in taking so many children? We don't know. I only see it in individual cases that come to me, and they are troublesome. Do they represent the whole group? I don't know. Nobody's done the study. And all the other reasons why somebody might become a foster parent, we don't know. So let's talk about adoption. I'm switching off of foster care into something that is closely related. About half of foster children are adopted or are in guardianship. Half. 3% of all adoptions fail, and the children no longer live in that family. And many more have problems, but stay with the adopted family. Children who are over 4 years old at adoption and children in puberty have more problems with adoption than do younger children. Being over 4 and being at puberty are risk factors in adoption. Adoption breakdown is at higher risk either right after the family gets the child and they see that it doesn't work, or when a long-term adoption has a child approach puberty. That's a breakdown point. Why? I have some thoughts on it, but there isn't research. Being very young, less than 4, having fewer previous separations, and being adopted by your foster parents if you were in foster care equals more success. The irony here is that in the US, foster parents have priority in adoption. If they will adopt the child, there is no contest. That child will be adopted by them. It is the opposite in the UK. It used to be in the US, by the way. But right now in the UK, the parents who are considered possible for adoption do not include the foster parents. So there will be a separation, and that is a risk factor for the adoption. When there is an adoption breakdown, the adoptive parents tend to attribute the child's problems to prior maltreatment before the child came to them as a child. The children, when they are asked, attribute problems to the adoptive parents. My parents are peculiar, they're stressed, they have mental problems, and to the professionals who wouldn't listen to them. That's a UK study, a quite substantial, long-term UK study. Who's right? Is it the prior maltreatment of adoptive children? Is it the condition of the adoptive parents? Is it the professionals who didn't listen to the children? Is it all of these? And then a study done by Steve Farnfield, who is here, I don't know if you can get him up on the screen, but he's here, looked at pre-adoptive parents and found that almost a third of them showed confusion about why they were adopting. And many of them had experienced prior losses and lack of fertility. We didn't know these things, and we need to know this and much more. Again, not to stop the adoption, but to enable the parents to do the best job they can with the self that they bring forward as the adoptive parent. I suspect that this confusion about why they are adopting is what shows up at puberty, when all of a sudden the adult, the adoptive parent, can foresee that this reproductive child is not going to pass their genes forward. And now they have to choose. Am I in this for loving a child, for passing on my personal culture, my family culture, or do I want to pass on my genes? Puberty brings up conflict between these two. Is the research there? I remind you again, it is not. That's my personal hypothesis about why puberty brings some problems. So 3 recommendations that we would offer for how to improve adoption. Give foster parents priority. If they are willing to take the child, to keep the child as an adoptive child in a forever home, let them do that. Do not separate this child again. And when the foster parents cannot afford to adopt, then have the government resources used to give them the resources they need. A child should not have to change parents because his parents are not wealthy. The adoptive parents should help children to maintain prior relationships for as long as the child wishes. I guess every adoptive parent wants a clean child who remembers only the adoptive parent. That's not the reality. Many adoptive children have had relationships, dear, intimate, trusting relationships with other people. We should work to maintain them as long as the child wants it. That's a both-and solution. Both the adoptive parents and the parents from before the adoption. Give the child more, not less. Divorce rates are rising. This is a graph that goes from 1987 up to 2007. Look at how rates of divorce are rising in the United States, but other than the actual numbers being different, the trend is the same everywhere. And the consequences of divorce for children are generally negative for their behavioral and mental health. Divorce is very hard on children. Having divorced myself, having seen other people who divorced, it's not easy for adults either. And that makes it so hard for them to be there to support their children through what is a really difficult thing for everyone in the family. The effects of divorce are reduced family income, changed care arrangements if there are children who cannot be on their own after school yet, often a change in residence, and that's challenging for everybody, adults included. Maternal depression is frequently an outcome of divorce, and children most often live more time with their mothers than with their fathers. And in some cases, their mothers will be forced to get a job when they had not needed to do so before. There are multifactorial effects on the children. There is separation, but there's also the pre-divorce conflict. There's the lower income, and there may be coercive parental control if the parents are battling each other. And these come together to make divorce harder for children than if there was less separation, less conflict, more money, and less coerciveness between the adults. The better outcomes from divorces are cooperative divorce. Higher income, cut in half. It's better than less income, cut in half. And pre-divorce sensitivity to children's signals on the part of mothers. When mothers were more sensitive to their children, in data collected before there was a divorce, they continue to be more sensitive after the divorce. And that's beneficial to the children. Cooperative divorces. Let me put in another personal example. You know, I had foster children. After 20 years of marriage, my husband and I decided it would be best if I moved to Miami for my first academic job, and he stayed in our home in Charlottesville. It was horrible reasons. I can't tell you how horrible it is unless you've had a divorce, and then you know it. To think that the person you thought was going to be the most important person in your life is not even going to be in your life anymore. It tears the adults apart. The question becomes, will they tear each other apart in their distress? We somehow understood that each of us was suffering, and neither of us would get the money we wanted, the access to our daughter that we wanted, which was full-time for each of us, that we were going to have to give up stuff. And so we worked out our own agreement. We knew once the lawyers got in, we would never agree on anything. We made the very painful decisions how to divide up stuff. The way we did is irrelevant. It was the way that worked for us. The only thing we couldn't divide was our daughter. It's the old Solomon's problem, King Solomon's problem. We knew that one of us would get the holidays and the other one would get the school days. And who would get which? The one who got the school days got the less desirable time, but more of it. The other got all the fun time, but less of it. We both wanted the school days, more of our daughter. We chose to flip a coin, and we lived with the outcome of an unpredictable parental, because we couldn't argue that either one of us was an inadequate parent. There just was no way to resolve it fairly to us, fairly to our daughter. And we took that agreement to one attorney. I took it. And he said, you can do better than this. I can get you this and this and this. And I said, but you can't get peace. And I'm bringing you an agreement that is peaceful. Don't change anything. We have chosen how to make our future. That's what I mean by cooperative divorces. It can be done, and it is painful, and everybody cries. And the timing of divorce matters. Early childhood divorces are more negative than when children are older. They've seen how the marriage works, and they can understand the language that is used to explain it to them, if anybody chooses to explain it to them honestly. And finally, shared custody is better for the children than one-parent custody. There are almost 1 million divorces in the United States per year. That's more than 1 million children, because many of those families have multiple children. They've seen the fighting. They've seen the father depart, because that's how it almost always happens. And they are left alone with dealing with the outcomes of an absent father and a distressed mother. This is an emotional event, and it's terrible emotions. Very few mothers have the ability to reach out of their own distress and understand their children's perspectives. This is a card that we use in the SAA. It doesn't say where the father is going. To work this morning? To visit his family? Doesn't say. It's a card that elicits very distressing stories from children whose parents are in conflict or have had a divorce. Either they go in the direction of terrible pain and distress or denial that anything happened. Divorce is very hard for children to manage psychologically. So some recommendations. Do out-of-court solutions. I described mine. It's a lot less expensive. We paid for an hour or two of an attorney and nothing more, just to write up the paperwork. And it gave us control of our own lives. We had another 6 years of raising our daughter together. There were no disputes. We had written our future. And we acknowledged the goodness of the other parent that we didn't want to live with anymore. And we didn't fight about it. We still worked together. Funny story. I had a great first husband. He was just right for the first 2 decades of my life, or maybe 15 years. Now when we get together, which isn't too often, I know this man. It's so comfortable. We feel so right together for about 2.5 hours. The last 30 minutes before we part, I remember all the reasons why we divorced. You can do out-of-court solutions. You simply need to respect the other person and take back control of your joint lives. There needs to be support for low-income parents. Housing subsidies, school lunches, medical insurance, whatever it is that half a family can't afford. And I think we need empathy for the children. So much attention is gone to how difficult it is for the parents. I was asked once how the housing should go in one country. And I said, oh, the house should go to the child. And the parents would move in and out with whatever frequency was deemed appropriate. At least the child wouldn't change bedroom, wouldn't have to move their belongings, would be able to live their life in the routines that they had established. I thought that was the best for the children. I was told parents couldn't handle it. Parents couldn't handle it. So we think the children can, and we move them about. I understand why this solution isn't chosen, but I think we forget how hard it is on a child to pack up some of his stuff in a suitcase and move through the knowing he's going to pack it up again. We need more empathy for children in undisputed divorces who have to change home. Parental incarceration. The United States incarcerates 2.7 million parents per year. You see the UK. Canada doesn't collect data. Canada doesn't collect foster care data. They don't collect parental incarceration. Never mind. Here it is for Europe. And you can see that for the 5 biggest countries, it's almost 500,000 children who have parents who are incarcerated. That's much less than the US, but for each of those children, it makes a difference. I've already talked about children being separated from undocumented parents. It's the Trump example. But over one, the same thing. So I assume that includes your country. They just don't put it in the newspaper. And then there is the separation of children of indigenous parents. That's American Indian tribes, First Nations bands, Australian indigenous people, Nordic Sami and Karen, the Uyghurs in China, and more. Often they went into institutions with terrible outcomes. And if you read this last sign, the dreams of First Nations children matter too. The dreams of all these children matter. When the separation involves an institution, it's even more harmful. There is widespread sexual abuse, behavioral, mental health problems, maltreatment when in care, and of course, death. And the intergenerational effects are ongoing. You see this, I know it best, for the First Nations people of Canada and the American Indians. I'm going to call them Indians because when you ask them who they are, they say Indians or natives. They do not say Native Americans. The Indians. Alcoholism, family violence, incarceration, child neglect, foster care, broken or single parent families. We've had negative multi-generational effects trying to enculturate to our better white middle class culture the children of Indians and First Nation Canadians. And it goes on here right now in democracies. There are more than 10,000 Canadian First Nations children who are in foster care and institutions. And here's a map of the percentages of such children. 100% in one part of Canada, 95% in another, 68%. In the middle of Canada, which is where the First Nations bands tend to live, where they were pushed into, the rates are the highest. That's an increase in 2 years of almost 10%, and it doesn't include the Métis and Inuit children, so the figures are lower than actual. The conditions that affect outcomes for all children. This is not Indigenous groups, this is all children who are separated. The most harmful separations are between 9 months of child age and 9 years of child age. That's when the separations occur. We don't mostly separate the little babies or the adolescents. We separate children when the effects will be the most harmful. When the separation occurs while the child is sleeping or at school, the effects are more negative. We do it because it's easiest for us. There's less protest. We make the job easy for ourselves. And the effects are worse if we separate siblings. The number of changes affects how children will respond. And the more often we separate children, the less they are able to form secure new relationships. And because they are stressed, their brain development is affected. We do harm. Minority and male children are affected more. And most of the people making these decisions are majority and female. So if we want to know about the voices, the dispositional representations of children, we need to listen to how they describe such events. And often they describe being taken to foster care as kidnapping. You're taken by a stranger to a stranger. They think they're kidnapped. Children say that the separation is more traumatic to them than the maltreatment at home. One boy described his anger as being like a volcano when it erupts. How much control does he think he has? How bad is it? How burned by it is he? One child, Drew, was asked to draw her family. She was 13 years old. We called her Restless Nellie. She had been in several foster placements. She'd been in an adoption that broke down. And she had last seen any member of her family when she was 3. She'd never seen the youngest sister that she knew about and put in the family. We said, when she was adopted, 3 years in a home, draw your family. And she drew the biological family with a sister she'd never seen. What family did she identify with? Why didn't we let her see these people? Same thing for another boy. He's 9 years old. He had been in 5 kin and foster placements in the past 2 years. We said, draw your family. Look at me in black with arms that can't do anything as if they were tied to his side. And when we asked, what are you doing? He says, don't know. Doesn't even put the word I in that sentence. Don't know. Look at the color. His troubled parents wanted him back. He didn't know what he was doing in his drawing. And I asked, what identity did separation from his family give him? After 5 other families, what was his idea of family and his place in it? And are there other children like that? Do you know of any? Because I don't think he's the only one. The experience, the dispositional representations of the adults. How do biological parents experience separation? What do they learn about their permanent rights to keep their children the first time one is taken away? Can they ever trust, when the child comes back as reunified, that no one will take him away again? Does that change them? Foster parents, what's their experience knowing that their child can be returned home or adopted away? What's the experience of child protection professionals who have tried everything they know to help this family? They'd offered this service and that service, and it didn't help the family. And now they have to go to court. How do they feel about themselves? How effective do they feel? Are they depressed? Are they angry? I doubt they feel positively disposed to a family who made no improvement in spite of everything they tried to do. How do the judges feel when they get these impossible cases that have no successful outcome? They only have less worse outcomes, and the judges themselves know the law. They don't know family life. They don't know the developmental literature. They have to count on other people. How do they feel? How do therapists feel? They were sent this family, and they couldn't do anything that protected them enough that the case didn't go to court. And what do we know about these different perspectives? What do we need to know? What research needs to be done so that we can make better informed decisions? So some conclusions. Separating children from their parents is always harmful. Speaking rhythmically always makes the greater impression. Short separations are as distressing as long ones. Don't think that just a month, just over the weekend in respite care, that won't do harm. The harm is done when the child discovers they've been removed. I think that only imminent threat of irreparable harm justifies separation. Anything else, to me, means save your money from foster care and send a professional out tomorrow to reevaluate. And there are effective protections that do not involve separating children. Reducing an adversarial approach is necessary. Once you go into adversarial mode, you're always exaggerating things, distorting them. Increasing the number of people who care for a child and their families is a benefit to the families and to the communities in which they live. The benefits of both and solutions are incalculable. We can't calculate the suffering of separation, and the benefits of both and solutions are equally incalculable in a positive way. Whose fault is it? The intentions are always good. The people working in child protection do want to protect children. Governments fund what we ask them to fund, which is investigation and foster care. Bureaucracies grew and the problems were not reduced. Whatever we're doing, it isn't working adequately. Our intentions are good. Our outcomes are not adequate. The quick fixes were preferred, a 12-week program, a designated therapy, instead of zone of proximal development care for the parents. We have a package for you. You take it, you'll be better. Nope. Emotional life is not like something that needs penicillin or an antibiotic. Doesn't work that way. And when this started, foster care, no one had identified that separation itself was harmful. They didn't know they were doing harm. On the other hand, once we know, we all bear responsibility to act to reduce the destruction to families of separating the parents from the children. So we have a broad call to action. I would change child protection to family protection. Children are safer when their parents are safe. I would offer more practical services that do not require the parents to change because they've demonstrated they can't the way we're doing it, but that will help the running of the family on a daily basis. I would add adults to families rather than taking children out of families. I would employ paraprofessionals, people from the neighborhood, to help the family. I would include the harmful effects of separation in decision making, hoping that we would separate fewer children. And I would shift the financial resources from foster care, investigation, litigation, and administration to direct services to children, families, and neighborhoods. Success and change are possible. One quick point. The problem was a Native American boy who was placed at birth with a white family. His father had murdered his mother and was in jail. The law gives tribes the right to raise tribal children. And the tribe said, when the boy was 3 years old, give him back to us. And they had the law on their side. At 3 years old, the boy knew only the family he had been living with, and he couldn't read the law. His foster parents wanted to adopt him. No person in the tribe did, but the tribe wanted him back. The solution was an interesting one. A woman named Sandy Whitehawk was a witness for the tribe, and she told how terrible separation from her mother had been for her when she was a child, and she was put in an institution. No, she was put in foster care with a white woman. The tribe asked that our paper on the effects of separation be disallowed. We thought that Sandy Whitehawk's trauma should not happen again to any Indian boy, including this boy. He should not be ripped out of a family like she was ripped out of a family. The tribe considered that and came back agreeing that the foster parents could adopt if they could be active relatives to the boy, sharing vacations, sharing holidays in both homes. That was agreed. And the judge bent the rules of the law for a little boy. It can be done. It was a both and solution. The boy got more family, and he got his Indian culture back. So if you want to see the full review and the citations, you'll need the citations if you go to court to say these things. This is the web address. Use a screenshot, and it's yours. So there's a little time for discussion, your questions, if you have examples that you want to talk about, and any comments that you want to make. I'm going to lose my last slide. I want to thank you for coming. I want to thank IASA for offering these, and Alex Jack and Stephanie Wilson for putting them on. And I offer you our emails in case you want to send Susan or me any questions or comments or whatever. Again, a screenshot will make it yours. So back to a discussion.
Thank you both for such an important and emotional talk. At the beginning, you said that you were going to present some facts, but I found the talk incredibly moving. So I wondered if you have any ideas about how you can share these ideas with policymakers to get the word out.
Well, there are a number of policy papers that Pat and I have considered, and we have made inquiries, and we haven't exactly been invited to do so. I think it's going to be something we need to continue. There's the Society for Research and Child Development Social Policy Review that may be interested in us, but they've had a new leader, a new editor, who's not sure that now we would meet, the mission of the policy reports. There it's coming out in abbreviated form as a chapter, and it could be in other papers. I also think presentations that at organizations that deal with judges and courts and so on would be receptive to this. But Pat and I have to make those trips to those conferences, and it's slow going. I really think that all of you can have a role in that, in terms of using the paper if you are in a court situation or advising, spreading the word. I do think it's going to be a slow process, but we're on it. Pat, do you have anything to add?
We have a couple of people who have offered to revise the paper to make it suitable for particular journals. The offer is open to any of you. Take this paper, revise it, make it fit a journal that you and your colleagues read. We're happy for you to do that. Yes, we'll still claim authorship, but your name will go on too. Please get the word out. Go to conferences. I'll happily share the slides. And if you do specific court cases yourself, get our full paper. Go to court and explain to them with citations why this is so important.
Thank you both. I would add that the DMM community is a good space for sharing ideas. So outside of this talk, if anyone has any thoughts, please share them there as well, and we can pass them to Dr. Crittenden and Dr. Spieker. We will also make the video available on YouTube afterwards, so you are welcome to share that. Hamish Hill, you have a question.
I wondered whether either or both of you had considered contributing to a film on this topic as a way of reaching a broader audience.
No, do you have the means?
Not right now, but maybe in the future.
I said earlier, I think this is the most important single finding I've ever had. I have a lot of stuff I think is really important. Please read everything I wrote. But this is the most important. This would affect the most children the most positively. If you know a way to get it out, I would try to cooperate with that.
Cool. Thanks.
For everyone, if you thought of an example of any of the kinds of problems that Susan and I described, would you please write one of us and just tell us in a few words what your example was? If we can use it in the future to make these points more vivid, we will. I should tell you, you probably saw it, that the family that I showed standing in court with their now adopted son is here and heard this presentation and wrote to all of you saying that it was helpful and they were glad to be the example. They got a son out of the deal and he got a family. What more can we want? So if you have good examples, please let us know. Thank you so much for coming.